if I want to send a remittance to my relative in Cuba, the Cuban government takes a slice, right?
They do, but your relatives probably want their part of that anyway.
I know, but the Cuban government gets a slice.
Yes.
So let's not deny that the Cuban government is greatly enriched by all these resources, which is why it has been its #1 foreign policy objective. Now, let's talk about what full diplomatic relations are. You're going to be having this discussion tomorrow, as I understand. What my colleague, Senator Markey, said normalized relations are. After the Summit of the Americas, the Washington Post ran a story suggesting that the talks to restore diplomatic relations were hung up because the Castro regime was unwilling to grant unrestricted travel to our diplomats, unwilling to allow us to send secure shipments to a future embassy, unwilling to let us have the number of staff necessary to operate a future embassy, and unwilling to remove the military presence around a future embassy. So let me ask you, would the State Department actually agree to establish an embassy in Havana if all of our diplomats aren't able to travel freely throughout Cuba?
Senator, what I can tell you is that we have to have an embassy where our diplomats can get out and travel and see the country and talk to people. We have restrictions on the way our embassy personnel travel in terms of notification to governments in many countries around the world that range from 24 hours to 10 days. So we are going to do everything possible to make sure that we have the least restrictions possible, but our embassy
So we will
officials,
accept restrictions that
well,
not all of our diplomats at an embassy would be able to travel throughout the country.
we will make sure that the embassy is on a par with the way we operate in other places that are restrictive environments. But
would you agree to conditions under which we can send secure shipments to supply a future embassy without the regime rifling through them?
well, Senator, I'm not going to necessarily lay out all of the negotiations for tomorrow
Well, why not?
here.
I mean, wait a minute. Are these
Senator, no,
negotiations
let me-
secret, or do we not have the
Senator,
United States Congress have the right to understand
You-
how you are trying to establish diplomatic relations?
Absolutely
I think
do.
the nation needs to know under what conditions we are going to have or not have relationships.
You
So
absolutely
are you going
do.
to allow the Cubans to rifle through your diplomatic pouches with impunity? Or are you going to insist that you can send anything to the embassy as we do in other places in the world? That's a simple
We
yes or no.
absolutely believe in the inviolability of the diplomatic pouch. We also believe that it's critical to resupply a future embassy, as we've believed it's important to supply the building now that has maintenance and upkeep issues. So that's a critical part of our
So
discussion.
will you accept conditions less than that?
We won't accept conditions in which we can't securely supply our facilities.
Would
We have
you
to be able
agree to
do that.
open an embassy if you aren't granted the number of staff you need to operate it efficiently?
Not if we can't have the number of staff we believe we need, no.
And are you willing to open an embassy if the Castro regime doesn't remove its military cordon from around the building, which basically is a way to intimidate average Cubans from approaching our facility?
We will not open an embassy unless we believe that the security outside the embassy is appropriate to protect our installation, but we will also make sure that it is welcoming of Cubans into the installation as an embassy, the way we do around the world.
Let me ask you, you agreed with me ultimately that the Castro regime's statement as it relates to that they have never supported any act of international terrorism is not true. So if you agree that these statements by the Castro regime are categorically false, how can you explain to the committee why you would think you can believe any assurances about the regime's current or future conduct if they bold-faced lied in the first place?
What I would say, Senator, is that what we were looking at in the assurances is not necessarily whether or not their assertions on behalf of all recorded history for the Cuban government we agree with every statement of the past. What we have to look at is what the requirements are under the law, which talk about the rejection of international terrorism, which they have made, and the lack of any support or any evidence for support
So they can
for
partially,
international
so they can
terrorism.
partially lie to you, but not fully lie. and
Senator,
we
we
will
have
believe that.
differences in what we believe. They do not believe they have ever supported
I know,
international
but they sent
terrorism.
you a letter, and the State Department quoted that specific sections, which basically means
Which-
you buy into it. It's incredible to believe that that section of the letter you buy into. Let me ask you this. The Red Cross, under the President's December 17th announcement, was supposed to have access to Cuban jails. Has that taken place?
We do not say that the Red Cross would have access to
What does the Red Cross?
jails.
You announced that they would have, I understand it was access to Cuban jails. What is it that they have access to?
I don't believe we ever said that the Cubans had agreed to that. What we said was that we were hoping that international organizations would renew their discussions with the Cuban government about those issues, including the Red Cross and the UN. In other words,
Has the Red Cross been able to get in freely into
Not
you?
that I know of.
Not that you know. Okay. Now, last question. We talk about telecom access. A lot has been discussed here about that. In late February, the first Vice President, Miguel Diaz-Canel, who Senator Boxer referred to as looks like he'd be the next heir in an election. First of all, there's no election in 2018, right? It's a selection. There's no election. Can we agree on that?
We can agree that what the Cuban government calls an election is not what we believe meets international standards.
It's the Cuban Communist Party, and that's it. So it's not an election. It's select. I don't want anybody to think that we're working on an election in 2018. He gave a long, rambling speech. He is the second highest official in the Cuban government about the Internet in Cuba. And one of the most revealing statements was the affirmation that the regime's Internet strategy would be led by the Communist Party. Given the Communist Party's half-century-long effort to deprive the Cuban people of the most minimal standards of freedom of the press and of information, would you have the committee believe that the Communist Party won't make every possible effort to block access to all content that it deems undesirable, similar to what we have seen in other closed societies around the world?
Senator, what I know is that when more people have access to the Internet, even if governments try to prevent them seeing things they don't want them to, they are remarkably inventive in finding ways to do so.
Okay, good. So then let me ask you this. Can we have your assurances that the State Department and the United States government will take all possible steps to ensure that the Cuban people have access to circumnavigation technologies that will be able to get around regime censorship? If we're going to say we want U.S. companies to go and develop this infrastructure in Cuba, surely we can have circumvention technologies so that the Cuban people are truly free to go see any site that they want, not only that which the regime wants them to see.
Certainly, I hope that the majority, the vast majority, or all of the Cuban people will be able to have complete access to the Internet.
Hope is not a public policy achievement. I'm asking you, if we are going to license companies under the Libertad Act to go ahead and put infrastructure in Cuba, can't we make a condition of that license that they have circumnavigation technology so that Senator Flake and Senator Udall and Senator Markey and everybody who wants access to the Internet for the Cuban people, which I also want, we're in common cause on that, actually can get access to the Internet? What's so difficult about insisting on circumvention technology?
I don't know that we can do that, but I also
We
know...
can put any condition that we want as a condition of sale.
I also
I wrote
suspect-
that section of the law
I
when I was in
understand.
the House of Representatives. I know what it says.
Okay.
And you can put conditions on. And I hope to hear back from you whether you will insist on that as a ability to have U.S. companies, if we want access to for the Cuban people to have the Internet, which I do.
Well, I do as well, Senator, but I also want them to be able to have those deals go through and to make it the most effective way that more on the island can have access
A deal
to the
without
Internet.
full access to the Internet is a deal
More than they have now.
to an end without access to the critical information that we think can help liberate the Cuban people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.